You have difficult years, there's lots of questions all over the place, and ultimately I saw some of the certain individuals that hadn't had anywhere near the success that I'd had, just talking negatively as they continue to do so today. People have asked me the same question for years. They want to know which victory meant the most, which championship was the hardest to win, or which lap I consider the best of my career. Some ask about the rivalries. Others want to talk about the records, the pole positions, or the moments that changed Formula One forever. I understand why. Those are the things people remember because they're easy to measure. But this question has always been much harder for me. Who were the greatest drivers I ever saw? Not the ones with the biggest trophy cabinets, not necessarily the fastest over one lap, and not simply the men who collected the most world championships. Greatness, at least from where I was sitting inside the cockpit, was never that simple. Sometimes it was the way a driver controlled a race without anyone noticing. Sometimes it was how calm they remained when everything around them was falling apart. Sometimes it was the respect they earned long before they climbed onto the podium. I've been fortunate enough to race across different generations. I grew up watching legends on television and found myself sharing the grid with heroes I'd never imagined I'd compete against. Later, I watched a new generation arrive and push the sport into places none of us could have predicted. Every era had drivers who forced everyone else to rethink what was possible. So these are the 5 drivers who left the deepest impression on me. Each of them changed the way I looked at racing, and in one way or another, each of them made me a better driver than I would have been without them. Let me start with Fernando Alonso. When I arrived at McLaren in 2007, I wasn't joining an ordinary Formula One team. I was walking into the same garage as the reigning 2-time world champion. Fernando had already beaten Michael Schumacher for consecutive titles in 2005 and 2006, and to most people in the paddock, he was the benchmark. I was a rookie who had never started a Formula One race. He was expected to lead the team. Looking back now, I probably couldn't have asked for a more difficult introduction to this sport. What made Fernando special was never just his speed. Plenty of drivers can produce one incredible qualifying lap, but Fernando understood every stage of a Grand Prix. He knew when to attack, when to protect the tires, when to pressure the driver ahead, and when finishing second was smarter than risking everything for a win. His racecraft always impressed me because it felt complete. Every decision had a purpose, and very few laps were wasted. From the other side of the garage, I saw just how much preparation and thought went into every race weekend. Being teammates meant we constantly measured ourselves against each other. Every practice session became important because the data from one car was immediately compared to the other. Every qualifying lap felt like its own battle. There was nowhere to hide. If I found a tenth of a second, Fernando wanted to know where it came from. If he was quicker through a corner, I wanted to understand why. That environment pushed both of us to operate at an incredibly high level. The pressure inside McLaren eventually became one of the defining stories of the 2007 season. We were fighting each other while also chasing the World Championship against Ferrari. The tension reached its highest point during the Hungarian Grand Prix, where disagreements within the team became public and damaged relationships that were already under enormous strain. In the end, both Fernando and I finished the season tied on 109 points, only 1 point behind world champion Kimi Räikkönen. It remains one of the closest championship battles Formula One has ever seen. Time has given me a very different perspective on those months. When you're young, you see every rivalry as something personal. As the years pass, you begin to appreciate what your competitors actually gave you. Fernando forced me to improve faster than I ever imagined possible. He taught me that Formula One isn't won by raw speed alone. It's won through patience, intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to perform under relentless pressure every single weekend. Even today, when I watch Fernando continue competing at the highest level after more than 2 decades in Formula One, I admire the same quality I noticed back then. His hunger has never disappeared. His commitment to understanding the car, the race, and every tiny detail remains extraordinary. Not every lesson in Formula One comes from victory. Some come from the people who challenge you the hardest. Fernando Alonso was the first driver who truly showed me what complete greatness looked like, and I've never forgotten that. Now I'd like to talk about Michael Schumacher. Like so many kids who dreamed of racing, I grew up watching Michael dominate Formula One. By the time I was climbing through karting and junior categories, he had already become the standard everyone measured themselves against. 7 world championships, countless victories, and an influence that reached far beyond the cockpit. I never imagined that one day I'd actually line up on the same grid as him, let alone race him wheel to wheel. What made Michael extraordinary was never just his results. It was the way he built success. He understood that winning didn't begin on Sunday afternoon. It started months earlier in the factory, during testing, in engineering meetings, and through endless hours working with the team. He demanded the highest standards from himself, and in return he inspired everyone around him to raise theirs. That level of commitment changed what people expected from a Formula One driver. When Michael returned to Formula One with Mercedes in 2010, he wasn't the same young driver who had dominated the early 2000s, but his racing instincts were still there. Every time we fought on track, I could see how naturally he placed the car, how difficult he was to pass, and how little room he left for mistakes. He never gave away a position easily, and every battle required complete focus. Racing against someone I had admired for so many years was both exciting and humbling. One moment that always stands out is the 2011 Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Michael defended brilliantly for lap after lap, making his Mercedes incredibly wide and forcing me to search for opportunities that simply weren't there. Eventually I found a way through with the help of DRS, but those laps reminded everyone why he had become one of the greatest competitors the sport had ever seen. Even near the end of his career, his racecraft remained exceptional. The longer I spent in Formula One, the more I appreciated everything Michael had contributed to the sport. He helped redefine professionalism, physical fitness, technical feedback, preparation, and teamwork became central parts of a modern driver's job because of the standards he helped establish. Drivers of my generation all benefited from that, whether we realized it or not. When people compare records, it's easy to focus on numbers. I've never looked at Michael that way. I remember the competitor who pushed every detail to its limit and showed the rest of us what total commitment really looked like. Some drivers leave behind championships. Michael Schumacher left behind an entirely new standard for greatness, and Formula One is still following it today. Then there was Sebastian Vettel. By the time Sebastian and I were fighting for championships, we both understood what it meant to carry the expectations of an entire team. He had already won 4 consecutive world championships with Red Bull between 2010 and 2013. And when Ferrari gave him a car capable of challenging for the title again, I knew I wasn't just racing another fast driver. I was racing someone who knew exactly how to win under pressure. What made Sebastian different wasn't simply his speed. It was his consistency when everything around him was working. If he found the right rhythm with the car, he could control an entire weekend. He was incredibly precise in qualifying, smooth with time management, and very rarely made the kind of mistakes that opened the door for his rivals. As a driver, you always knew that if Sebastian was leading the race, he wasn't going to hand you an opportunity. You had to earn it. Our biggest battles came during the 2017 and 2018 seasons. Ferrari had built a genuinely competitive car, and for long stretches those championship fights could have gone either way. Every weekend felt important because we were often separated by the smallest margins. One good strategy call, one perfectly timed safety car, or one mistake in qualifying could completely change the momentum of the season. That's what made racing Sebastian so demanding. He never allowed you to relax. I especially remember how intense the 2018 season became. Ferrari started the year with a package capable of winning the championship, and Sebastian pushed us hard from the opening races. Monza was one of those weekends where the pressure was enormous for both teams. Every decision mattered because we knew the title battle was entering its decisive phase. Those moments reminded me that championships aren't won through spectacular drives alone. They're won by delivering at an elite level over an entire season. As the years passed, my respect for Sebastian only grew. Away from the cockpit, people saw a different side of him. He cared deeply about the sport, about the people working behind the scenes, and eventually about issues that reached far beyond Formula One. We competed fiercely on Sundays, but that never stopped us from respecting one another. In fact, I think that respect became stronger because we understood what the other had sacrificed to reach the top. When I look back now, I don't just remember the championships we fought over. I remember a competitor who demanded my very best every single weekend. Sebastian never made success feel easy, and that's exactly why I value those battles so much. Some rivals measure your speed, others measure your character. Sebastian Vettel tested both, and that's why he'll always be one of the greatest drivers I've ever raced against. And then there was Max Verstappen. The first time I raced against Max, it was obvious he wasn't approaching Formula One like most young drivers. He arrived with confidence that surprised a lot of people, but once you watched him for a few races, you understood where it came from. He trusted his instincts completely. He wasn't intimidated by experience, reputation, or championships. To him, every driver on the grid was simply another competitor to beat. What made Max different was his absolute commitment in every wheel-to-wheel battle. He never left much on the table. If there was half an opportunity, he would take it. That forced everyone around him to think differently because racing against Max required complete precision. You couldn't assume he would back out of a corner, and you couldn't expect him to settle for second place if there was still a chance to fight. Every move had to be carefully judged because the intensity was always there. Our rivalry reached another level during the 2021 season. From the opening race in Bahrain, it became clear that Red Bull and Mercedes had built two cars capable of fighting for the championship every weekend. It turned into one of the longest and toughest title battles I've ever experienced. There were highs, setbacks, controversies, and enormous pressure that followed us from one Grand Prix to the next. Every qualifying session, every strategy call, and every point suddenly carried enormous weight. Several races from that season will always stand out. The collision at Silverstone, the dramatic incident at Monza where our cars ended up on top of each other, and the intense battles in Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Abu Dhabi tested both of us physically and mentally. Those moments weren't just about speed, they were about maintaining focus while the entire world analyzed every decision we made. Very few championship fights have been examined as closely as that one. Looking back now, I appreciate how much Max pushed me during those years. By that stage of my career, I had already experienced multiple championship battles, but he forced me to find another level. Every weekend demanded perfection because even the smallest mistake could decide the outcome of the title race. That's something every great rival gives you. They expose weaknesses you didn't know you still had. Our styles have always been different, and that's part of what made the rivalry so compelling. But I've always respected the commitment Max brings every time he climbs into the car. He races with complete belief in himself, and that's a quality every champion needs. Formula One is always moving forward. Every generation produces someone who changes the standard for the next one. Max Verstappen has done exactly that, and racing against him reminded me that no matter how much you've achieved, this sport will always find someone capable of pushing you to your absolute limit. And finally, Ayrton Senna. I never had the privilege of racing against Ayrton. By the time I arrived in Formula One, he had already become one of the sport's greatest legends. But that never made his influence feel distant. In many ways, he was with me long before I ever sat in a Formula One car. As a kid growing up in Stevenage, I watched videos of Senna over and over again. I wasn't just fascinated by how fast he was. I was inspired by the passion, commitment, and emotion he brought every time he climbed into the cockpit. What made Ayrton different wasn't simply his incredible speed, it was the feeling he created whenever he was on track. In qualifying, he seemed capable of finding another level that very few drivers have ever reached. In wet conditions, he made the impossible look almost routine. But beyond the driving itself, there was an intensity about him that inspired generations of racers. You could see how completely he devoted himself to every lap, every corner, and every opportunity to compete. As my own career developed, I began to understand why so many drivers spoke about him with such admiration. His influence wasn't measured only by 3 world championships or unforgettable victories. It was the standard he set for commitment. He believed that if you were going to race, you gave everything you had. That philosophy stayed with me throughout my career, especially during the difficult moments when winning seemed out of reach. One of the most meaningful experiences of my life came in 2021 at the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. Before the race weekend, I had the opportunity to drive Ayrton's 1990 McLaren MP4 5B at Interlagos. Sitting in that car, wearing a replica of his famous yellow helmet, was an emotional moment that is difficult to describe. It wasn't about pretending to be Ayrton. No one could ever do that. It was about paying respect to someone whose legacy helped shape my own journey into Formula One. Over the years, I've also been fortunate to spend time with Ayrton's family and support the work of the Senna Foundation. Those experiences reminded me that his impact reaches far beyond racing. He inspired people through his generosity, his determination, and his belief that success should create opportunities for others. That's a legacy far greater than any statistic could ever capture. When people ask me who the greatest drivers I've ever seen are, Ayrton's name will always be part of that conversation. Not because I raced against him, but because he helped shape the driver I dreamed of becoming long before I ever reached Formula One. Some legends leave behind records that are eventually broken. Others leave behind an example that continues to inspire decades later. For me, Ayrton Senna will always be one of those rare people whose influence never fades. When you spent most of your life in Formula One, you eventually realize that time changes what matters. Championships become part of the record books. Victories become statistics. Someone will always come along and win another race or break another record. That's the way this sport has always worked, and I think that's a beautiful thing. What stays with you are the people, the drivers who challenged you, inspired you, frustrated you, and ultimately made you better than you could have become on your own. Every one of them shaped a different chapter of my career, and every lap we shared helped define the person I am today as much as the driver I became. I feel incredibly fortunate to have raced in an era where I could learn from legends, compete against champions, and witness the arrival of a new generation that continues to raise the standard of Formula One. When the helmets are put away and the engines are finally silent, those memories are what remain, and for me, they'll always mean far more than any trophy sitting on a shelf. Thanks for listening.